It's 33 minutes after the hour of 8 a.m. Central Time, where we are. The Power Mall is now open at 877-817-9829. Fred Dashevsky, who you just heard the commercial for, he joins us now. You know, Fred, it's always great to talk to you because you're just a wealth of knowledge. Besides being, 40 years in the U.S. gold and silver, the rare coin industry with the numismatics, you just held up a gold coin. Wish I had me one of those. Tell me about what you were just holding up. Is that the St. Gaudens?
That is a St. Gaudens. I don't know how well the image is coming out. It's a very lustrous coin, so it shines a lot off of the camera light. But these were the original $20 gold pieces from the early 20th century. So design-wise, there was a change in 1907 when Roosevelt had a childhood friend who was an artist. His name was Augustus St. Gaudens, and St. Gaudens had gone to what's called the Beaux-Arts School in France and had studied to become a sculptor, had come back, and then his friend, who had now become president, asked him to redesign the American gold coins, which had been pretty stagnant since the 1860s. So think about it, from roughly the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the 20th century, we had not changed design on the American gold coins. And that was fine. I mean, money is money, but after a while, people get a little tired of the same thing. So Roosevelt asked his buddy if he could redesign the standard $2.5, $5, $10, and $20 gold pieces. He made it as far as the 20s and 10s, and then he passed away. But the design that he came up with for the $20 gold coin, which started in 1907 with his new design, and they would run until the production of all the gold coins in the U.S. in 1933 ended completely. It became one of the most beautiful gold coins in the world. It has that full standing image of Miss Liberty. And on the reverse side, if you can see it, you've got that beautiful American eagle. And these were just really, really well accepted by the public. The first year they came out in 1907, and then in 2008, they made an interesting decision to take the words "In God We Trust" off the coin. In the 1860s, the U.S. government decided that every American coin should have the words "In God We Trust." There was a, compulsion to kind of say, we want to tie ourselves to things we believe in as a nation, and that should be included in the way our money works. So that terminology, or what's known as the motto, "In God We Trust," was on every coin from the 3-cent piece from 1864 until 2008. So they pulled it off because at that point they took this momentarily weird thought that somehow it was controversial to have church and state mixing. And they said, we should separate that. We shouldn't imply anything religious in the monetary system. So they took the words off, and the coin came out, and it hit the streets, and there was a knee-jerk reaction like you would not believe from the public. They did not like it. They wanted to see those words, "In God We Trust." So it immediately was put back on the coin, but it became infamously known as the No Motto Saint from 1908. They made lots of them, so it's not particularly rare, but it's really interesting that we went through this little, unusual kind of thought process for a moment there. But the coin lasted to 1933 and stands today still, I think, as one of the most beautiful gold coins in the world. And even mint condition examples are, still less than $3,000. It's remarkable to me.
Now, are those MS-64s? That one you had?
Yeah, they're in the $2,600, $2,700 range. And, if you think about that, an ounce of gold's $2,000. So, I think we've talked about this. If a jeweler made you a nice piece of jewelry out of an ounce of gold, what would he charge for it? So the idea that you could buy actual currency of the United States that can't be reproduced, and, about 90% of these things were melted in the 1930s. So we're left with about 10% of the original mintage, and you can get these high quality, graded, certified mint condition examples and only spend a few $100 more than the metal they're made of. That to me is remarkable, and I think it creates one of the more interesting opportunities for investors.
Right, and that's investors. And see, this is why we're talking about Fred is a member of the American Numismatic Association, has been for a long time. And the company he runs, he's the owner and founder of U.S. Coin Capital, and that's capital as in O-L, not A-L, even though capital does talk about, it refers to money and having money. The standard of value and the store of value in America is swiftly changing. And a lot of it has to do with the garbage that they're trying to push, which is the CBDC. But the Fed just can't stop. And we talked about the CFI or the CPI today, the Consumer Price Index. The Fed, I know we were talking before we went on about a list of things that were going on in the country, and one of them is the Fed, again, toying with interest rates.
Well, they're in an interesting position. The Fed has been fighting a battle of, they've printed a tremendous amount of money to stimulate economic activity. We all accepted that when COVID kicked in because, the entire country, as we recall, had come to pretty much a screeching halt. I mean, I remember, New York City, Manhattan, being closed. I mean, street after street of all these main businesses were just shut down. And in order to kind of kickstart the economy, the Fed decided we can stimulate economic activity by making money cheap and available. And that's an old economic trick. It goes back to the days of Adam Smith. And it's well understood that it works, but it comes at a cost. And the cost is it inflates the hell out of the money that you do this with. And it creates a fundamental problem of a runaway inflation issue that you then would have to address by trying to now reverse the process and slow down the economy. And the Fed does that by raising interest rates. So after the flood of money poured into the U.S. economy for a couple of years, the Fed realized the inflation numbers were starting to grow a little faster, and it almost became kind of like a snowball. I mean, it really got out of control. I think the peak was probably around the fall of last year. We were talking to people about the shock that they were experiencing at the supermarkets. I mean, it was just almost week after week price increases were occurring. So much so that it wasn't hidden anymore in the underlying statistics that, maybe you guys like you and I might follow, but an average person doesn't really see it. But people were affected by it this past few months, so much so that there was an outcry of, hey, we have to fight inflation. We have to beat this beast back. So the Fed went on a process of raising rates, and that's the key, is that they tried to slow economic activity. But now they're trying to find a balance point, saying, how far is too far? What if you overdo it and raise the rates so much that not only do you slow the economy down, but you choke it? And it goes back into almost a recessionary economic environment. And now you're back where you started. Now you've got to go back to the beginning and stimulate economic activity again. So this is the game the Fed is playing. It's like a roller coaster. It's like, ride it up, but don't go too high. Now we got to slow it down as it comes, maybe tap on the brakes a little bit. And they're trying to provide this perfect soft landing. Well, on this, there was this expectation that the Fed was going to start lowering rates like this month, because everybody thought, okay, well, they're done. They've raised the rates enough. They've succeeded in this process. But a lot of people like me were sitting in the background saying, I'm sorry, I'm not buying it yet. I don't believe that they've really won the inflation battle. So sure enough, the CPI number, which is the Consumer Price Index, it used to be the old standard for how they measured inflation. And I don't know if you remember this, but back when the original CPI numbers came out, they literally took a loaf of bread and a gallon of milk and a gallon of water, these actual physical items, and calculated the difference in their price from one month to the next. That's what CPI used to be. But they ran into a problem because that number would go up faster than they wanted to show. So they started altering it. So instead of like the loaf of bread, it became, let's say, the cost of wheat, something they could spread out a little bit more and make a little more generic. And little by little, the CPI began to kind of not really relate anymore to reality, but it's still the statistic that they count on. So it came out yesterday, and it was a rocket high number. I mean, it was the highest increase in 10 years. And now everybody's saying, oh, well, maybe we overestimated how fast we think the Fed will start lowering rates. So now instead of this month, now it's, oh, well, maybe it's going to be May and June. And, a lot of the more conservative people are thinking, I don't think we'll see a rate drop before probably fall or maybe the end of the year. And I'm still in that camp. So I didn't buy into this, rapid drop in interest rates coming next month any more than I'm buying it now.
Well, but the bigger thing that we're dealing with here is the believability of all of this stuff. And it is election year. And so, it's like they just impeached Mayorkas in the House. And I'm like, yeah, why did they have to wait 3 years to do that with this problem we have? I mean, how many illegal immigrants right now can afford to buy a Satan Gaudens? None. None. And yet they're all over here and they're sucking off the teat of the government and our tax dollars. And we're cranking out money from the U.S. Treasury, and the Bureau of Printing and Engraving is printing more and more of these bills, and they're handing them debit cards with all this M2, M3 on it, and they're spending them like crazy, and there's violence going on, and we're sitting here thinking about how to preserve our wealth. And this is where the problem lies, is that they are manipulating the market. There is no question of that. That's why we have these cycles.
I get more concerned about this as I watch this over the years, because the size of the manipulation has really increased. When it's a minor adjustment, and I used to make an analogy like you're in a boat and you zip it along and, you move the rudder a little bit. You alter the direction you're heading. It's minor adjustments. The Fed is acting like the motor. They are driving the economy. They've become so much of an influence that they are, in effect, everything. If they screw up, the entire economy cannot sustain itself without the Fed now. And that's dangerous, because a reliance on a central bank to sustain an economy is a dangerous position for a country to be in. And it leads to tremendous amounts of volatility. This is the reason we're seeing all these rate ups and rates down and manipulations of the economy. And think about this, too, that it's not only the Fed manipulating the economy, but the corporate American companies that actually buy their own stock back have moved so much money into the markets. They put trillions of dollars last year. I think it was 1.2 trillion was spent by corporations to buy their own stock just last year. So if a stock goes up in price because hundreds or thousands or millions of investors believe in the company and say, I have faith in this company, I'm investing in their stock, well, that's one thing. If the company buys their own stock back because they have a plethora of cheap cash and raise the stock price, yeah, but people are making money in the stock. But is it real? You talk about an underlying manipulation. And what if these things stop? Where does everybody land if the manipulation ends? And I worry about how quickly these things can unravel. I'll tell you a funny story. About a week ago, we had a short power outage on Hilton Head, where I am. So we're on a small island in South Carolina. About a third of the island lost power. It didn't last more than a couple hours, but the traffic lights were out. The banks were closed. Everything was shut down. And I was looking around the town and I'm thinking, how long is this going to be before the crap just completely falls apart around here? I mean, how long will this go on before things start really unraveling? Can we last a day? What happens if it goes 2 or 3 days? The gas pumps don't work. You can't go into the supermarkets to buy food. Everything's closed. Nobody's got electricity. They can't run the cash registers. What are they going to do? How would people manage? I mean, could you go down to the supermarket with cash and hope they would open the doors and sell you what's on the shelves? So whenever you have huge manipulations underlying an economy, you better expect trouble. And I think what I see coming is events that could be really detrimental to an average person's wealth, very rapidly deteriorating value and creating a lot of uncertainty. And I think this is part of why we're finding so many people looking to add gold and silver coins now to their portfolios.
Yeah, that's the scary part, is hedging your bets. The thing, this is years ago, that I was playing in the markets. I actually went through Interactive Trader, got the software package, got trained and all that stuff. And the more I started looking at it through my training, the more I realized how playing the stock market was extremely volatile and not worth it. And anybody, I mean, the guys that are out there, I have friends of mine that are day traders that are just going crazy with this thing, and they started to see the volatility in this thing, and it's like, you can't trust the markets anymore. What can you trust? That's been a big problem. And I got out of the markets about 3 years ago. I haven't looked back.
Now, how many of those day traders make money?
Well, 3 of them did. On a regular basis, they made lots and lots of money. They made $70,000 a year just day trading.
Okay.
And I'm like, okay, great, but the thing is what'd you do with the proceeds once you got it?
Right.
See, that's the thing. If they're just paying to keep up with inflation, what good is it? Because isn't it a rich man's game?
It sure is. And, I look at it this way. I've always found that there's 2 forms of money. There's legitimately real tangible money. And I refer to things like, this as tangible and real, because it's a physical item. I can, as Sylvester Stallone said, I can pour ketchup on it. It's a physical thing. Unlike a Bitcoin, for example, I can't pour ketchup on it. It doesn't exist in the real world. So I don't want to go off on that topic. But anyway, my point being, I've always put things into different categories. And the stock market and the paper money markets, they're all in that open market, open money kind of category. But are they real? Are they tangible? And what determines their wealth? So what establishes the value of that paper note we carry around? And what establishes the value of that $20 gold coin? They're very far apart. And I think for most Americans, if they are relying exclusively on the paper side of the world, they are exposing themselves to all the things we're talking about, these potential upsets, these problematic interferences into the market that could create either, ups and downs and price swings, huge market crashes. Anything could happen in a moment's notice. I just think wealth protection in the modern era is sort of just like fire insurance. You just can't live without it anymore.
Well, the bigger problem, and you brought it up, because I want to mention, they came up with blockchain, they came up with Bitcoin, and Bitcoin, they call it Ether. And it's a gas. I mean, it's like it's out there. And see, the one thing about paper and ether, and I'm sure you'll agree with me on this, Fred, they all rely on electricity.
Yep.
And if you don't have electricity, what happens to all that money you've got invested out there?
That's a really good point. See, I didn't even think about that for a moment. So the electricity grid, for example, drops. Can you access your Bitcoin? If you're locked out of your computer because you've got no power, can you access your digital currencies? And this is why I think at least some of the money people should be in an actual, real, tangible form. Because again, we're moving so fast into this electronic world that we have a whole generation of people who probably don't even know there were ever gold or silver coins in the United States as currency. They've never experienced it. They don't recognize why it was just so common and standard. The idea, like if we were in the 1920s and chatting about the economy, we would be using these $20 gold coins as money. We'd be spending them every day. But we would know inherently there's an intrinsic value there. There's an ounce of gold in that $20 gold piece. So I don't have to worry about a government determining that value. I don't have to have another party to tell me that it has value or find a group of like-minded people who decide they're going to accept it. It has value in its own intrinsic metal content. And that's the way monetary policies should operate. There should be a solid, real value. And I think people should just understand that there are different forms of money. Some of them are more, let's call it, real than others. And, it's okay to speculate in the exterior world of things, but I wouldn't count on it with too much of one's wealth in a volatile world that we live in. Because like you said, what happens if the electric grid drops? Wow, I can't even envision all the Bitcoin people.
Well, the thing is, though, aside from Bitcoin, when we're talking about the real coin, and the fact that back in the 20s we were trading this real stuff, what happens if the entire grid shuts down and the only thing you have to trade with is the actual intrinsic value of gold and silver coin? What are we looking at right now as far as, this is a legitimate question, Fred, and I'm sure you get it all the time, limits as to circulation. Have they tried to take more of it off? Of the governments, we understand the governments are buying more of it. They're hoarding it. I'm wondering, what about the average, we the people out there, and our ability to acquire this stuff? How much is in circulation that we can get our hands on?
Well, that's an interesting question. So governments are acquiring large quantities of physical gold bars and things, bullion products, in mass quantity. And I think that's because they all recognize the flaw in their own currencies and realize that they have to do this, whether they want to admit that to the public or not. When it comes to the American gold and silver coins, obviously we have a fixed supply, right? Those $20 gold pieces, they didn't make them after 1933. And again, melted about 90% of what they had produced before that point. So all we have left is that existing supply. And the silver coins up to 1964, again, fixed supply. They can't go back and ever produce another one. We've had shortages several times in the past few years that only lasted a couple of days or a week or so, but they were national. They were wide across the U.S., and it was problematic. I know for a fact, if anything were to crack in the monetary system on a large scale, like we had another bank failure last week, right? The Community Bank on Long Island. And that was no small bank, by the way. I mean, some people sort of dismissed it and said, oh, well, I've never heard of it. Well, there were 187 branches of that bank across the U.S. It was large, very large. And for them to fail, or if we had more of those, how would people deal with this stuff in these, situations? So, if there was a rush of money from Americans who became let's call it uncomfortable with the banking system, we would wipe out supplies of American gold and silver coins in a matter of days. And the only people who would ever have shots at getting them would be the ultra wealthy. The average guys never would have a chance. The big money would line up, they would clean out the market, and we'd all be sitting there scrambling, looking for anything we could find and loose change, because there'd be no other way to get coins. I worry about that a lot. Fortunately, at this point, we haven't had an overwhelming, like a real market crack that has shaken confidence in the public since last spring when we had those 4 bank failures. There was a rush, and there was a perfect indication of how quickly supplies of our industry product can get wiped out. So I do encourage people, if you're listening to this, I would rather have my gold and silver coins in my possession a year early than a day late. So don't wait.
Agreed. And folks, I know we only have less than a minute left of the show today, but on this Valentine's Day, there would be something you can do if you want to treat yourself or your loved one. You get on the phone and you call Fred at 1-800-878-2646. That's 800-878-2646. You can dial into his website at US Coin Capital, and that's olcapital.com. And you can call them, and their staff is standing by to take your call to help you out. This is the infomercial part. No, we don't mean to scare. This is not fear mongering. This is common sense logic we're having this discussion about. And as always, Fred, it's great to have you on. And I hope that our Power Hour listeners are telling you that they're calling because they heard you talk about this on the show.